Good evening.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Um, Thank you for joining us for today's virtual education program at Cancer Support Community South Bay. I'm Rebecca, the program manager, and I welcome you to this workshop titled Demystifying Sugar, Dairy, and Soy. What's the real story in cancer nutrition? Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, CSC South Bay's mission is to uplift and strengthen people impacted by cancer by providing support, fostering compassionate communities, and breaking down barriers to care. Our vision is that everyone impacted by cancer receives the support they want and need throughout their experience. We serve the South Bay, Long Beach, and Orange County area all at no cost. Our program includes support groups, networking groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and educational programs like this workshop. Educational programs are open to all. If you'd like to hear more about our services or join our community, please visit our website at cscsouthbay.org. Before I introduce today's speakers, we ask you to keep your microphone muted to eliminate any distracting background noise. Please feel free to enter any general questions into the chat function found at the bottom of the Zoom window. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our workshop speakers. We have four wonderful registered dietitians from Create Cures Foundation. Create Cures Foundation is a nutrition and longevity clinic based in Santa Monica, California, and provides dietary and lifestyle guidance to support cancer patients throughout their treatment journey. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. As we said, we're going to talk about demystifying sugar, dairy, and soy, the real story in cancer nutrition. So we're super excited to debunk some myths that maybe you guys already have about these topics. And who are we? We're part of the Create Cures Foundation Clinic. We were founded by Dr. Walter Longo, who has done research in nutrition, fasting for over 30 years. And we are a group of expert dietitians and molecular biologists, and even Dr. Longo himself, who we work collaboratively on our patients, and we work mainly in age-related diseases and cancer. And so we have found effective ways and integrative strategies to support cancer treatment and optimize outcomes. So we're really excited to talk about some of our findings today. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Dr. Longo and his work, I highly recommend watching his recent documentary, which you can get the link below. And it really dives into a lot about his research and how he discovered a lot of the things we talk about today, diet-wise, and even fasting. So it's super interesting. And also, he came out with a book this year called Fasting Cancer. So this book dives into detail about different types of cancer and how fasting can be a really amazing strategy. So I really highly recommend reading that for more information. Otherwise, we also have a YouTube at Create Cures where we talk more about cancer and other topics as well. And you could even reach out to us and work with us dietitians. So a little bit about me. My name is Shayna. I graduated from USC's Nutrition, Health Span and Longevity program. And I studied cancer nutrition and even did my master's in vitamin D and cancer. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today.
Thank you, Shayna. Hello, everyone. My name is Frida Hovik. I'm also a registered dietitian at CCF. I'm also completing my PhD under the supervision of Dr. Walter Longo, and I'm very excited to be here today and share some of the latest research insights in today's topic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lotta Andonian. I'm also a registered dietitian at the Create Cures Foundation. I got my master's in nutrition, health span, and longevity at the University of Southern California as well, and studied under Dr. Walter Longo in Italy. And I'm excited to talk to you today.
So excited to be here. My name is Katie Reines. I got my master's in human nutrition and I did my thesis on nutrition and cancer. I published my heart disease cookbook in 2021. It is so awesome to get to be here. We get a lot of questions about sugar, dairy, soy, and we mostly work with cancer patients. I'm really excited to be here with you all.
Amazing. So today we're going to talk about sugar and cancer, obviously, dairy and cancer, soy and cancer, and then we're going to dive into some practical nutrition strategies. We're going to quiz you guys at the end, so make sure you're paying attention. You don't want to miss it. And then at the end too, we're gonna do a Q&A. So I know you probably will have tons of questions throughout the whole webinar, but we kindly ask that ideally if we could wait until the end so that we can answer all the questions, that would be amazing. And then if we don't get to your question, we'll give you guys our email at our clinic and feel free to ask any questions you might have and we'll do our best to answer them. And then lastly, if there are any patient-specific questions, please save it for an email and we can book an appointment with one of us dietitians and go into more detail. So, to start, let's do a quick little myth or fact. So we're gonna dive into more of these in the webinar, but let's just go over some of the common myths. And I want you guys to comment down below in the chat box if you think it's a myth or if you think it's a fact. So first, big one, sugar feeds cancer. Comment below, let me hear what you think. Already seeing some yeses. Okay, so good ideas here, but we'll dive into more detail. And then all sugar is bad, including fruit and fruit juices. What do we think? Fruit juices? No, I'm seeing a no. Great. Well, we'll dive into it. But dairy changes your hormones. This is also a common one we hear. But is dairy good for the gut? We also hear that one. Does dairy increase risk of cancer? Does soy increase your estrogen? Does soy fuel hormone-sensitive cancers? So let's figure that out. But first, let's take a deep breath. There's so much noise and fear online around sugar, dairy, and soy. So we know that nutrition is super complex. We can't just look at a simple headline, we have to know the context too. So really, it's important to work with qualified professionals who you trust and who can help interpret the evidence for your individual situation. And that's a really key theme we'll hear is everybody, it might be different for everyone. So find someone, a professional that can help you figure out what is right for you. But it's always helpful to focus on the fundamentals, like balancing your blood sugar, a high fiber, plant-forward diet, anti-inflammatory patterns of eating and a lifestyle, and protein and nutrient density. So it's important to remember that no single food causes or cures cancer, but actually it's more so your overall dietary pattern and your lifestyle. So look at facts, look at good sources, and then try not to be so fearful because maybe the context is more important. And then again, if it's something overwhelming or confusing, pause and look at more trusted sources. And I'm going to pass it off to talk about sugar and cancer with Lotta.
Thank you so much, Shayna. That last slide is an amazing one to screenshot. Lots of great information there. And speaking of fear foods, let's get into sugar and cancer. So Shayna asked this earlier, but there's a myth out there that we should avoid all sugar to starve cancer. And on the next slide, we can just talk about, if we can move on to the next slide, we can first start with discussing what is sugar. So sugar is a type of carbohydrate, which is one of the three main macronutrients alongside fat and protein. And carbohydrates come in two main forms. There's the simple carbohydrates like sugars, monosaccharides like glucose and fructose, and then disaccharides like sucrose or table sugar. And then there are some things called complex carbohydrates, which are starches and fibers. And simple carbs and complex carbs work differently in the body, which we'll get into. But sugars also play some very interesting role in food itself. You can see how sugar, obviously, it often contributes a sweet taste to food, but it's involved in texture, browning, and caramelization. And then it also acts as a preservative by binding water, so it can improve shelf life. And these factors are very interesting to think about when we think about the prevalence of sugar in food today, especially processed foods, is likely due to a combination of all these benefits for food manufacturers. And then when we get into how sugar functions in the body, it's a quick source of energy, particularly glucose, which is also the brain's preferred source of energy. Glucose is actually so important that our body will make glucose if we don't have enough through gluconeogenesis. Even after prolonged ketosis, like after weeks of fasting, the brain still gets 40% of its energy from glucose. So even though our brain can function on ketones, it actually can never fully function on ketones, and we do need glucose. So if we think about like starving cancer from glucose or fructose, we actually are not going to be doing that. So that's something really interesting to keep in mind. And then what about natural sugar versus added sugar? We have seen some of these terms come up on food packaging or when we're reading about sugar. So naturally occurring sugar is what is found in whole foods. When we're thinking about fruit is an obvious source of sugar because of the sweetness, but also vegetables, grains, and dairy all have mixtures of simple and complex carbohydrates. And in these forms of sugar, it's all in a food matrix. So if we think about a vegetable or a fruit or even a whole grain, there's not just sugar. There's fiber, there's phytonutrients, there's micronutrients, and there's often other macronutrients like protein and fat mixed in. So the sugar is not going to be as quickly digested and absorbed compared to something like added sugars. And added sugars are sugars that are added during processing or preparation. So there are some obvious sources of added sugars, and actually 80% of Americans' intake of added sugar is from the form of sweetened beverages or things like cakes and candies and cookies. But there are some very unexpected sources of added sugars. If we're thinking about some of those, we can see sugar in breads and crackers, salad dresses and marinades, tomato sauce, some frozen meals, non-dairy milks. There's often sweetened versions of those. Even things like yogurt can have more added sugars than ice cream, and protein bars and protein shakes. So it's actually really important to look at nutrition facts labels when we're looking at the added sugar content of foods. And another term that comes up is refined and unrefined. So you might see some more natural looking products that will mention that there's no refined sugars, or that they only use unrefined sugar like coconut sugar. When we're thinking about the definition, the refined sugar just means that the sugar has gone through multiple purification cycles. So if we're thinking about like white sugar, it has all the molasses removed, or something like high fructose corn syrup is very highly processed from the original source being corn. And then there are unrefined sugars, which are minimally processed, like coconut sugar, date sugar, maple syrup, honey. But one thing to note is that those are actually both forms of added sugar. So they both are more rapidly digested and absorbed sugars with very little fiber or micronutrients. So some of the unrefined sugars will have trace minerals and some fiber. And they may have more flavor, which can help with reducing total added sugar consumption. But it is really important to just be aware of your total added sugar intake. And so when we're thinking about sugar, it's actually the added sugar in excess is what is associated with different chronic diseases, including the risk of multiple cancers. Particularly sugar sweetened beverages like sodas or some of the very sweet coffee drinks. These are, you can see like a sample nutrition facts label here, but they have very large quantities of added sugar, and no other macronutrients, so no fat, no protein, or very little fat and protein. And mechanistically, the way that this can promote chronic disease, including cancer, is that it's very easy to overconsume some of these products. So it can promote excess weight gain, which is associated with various cancers, but also can contribute to inflammation and insulin resistance, or poorly managed blood sugar. And there's additional evidence that can suggest that even independent of risk for obesity and some of these other factors, the influence of sugar on insulin and insulin-like growth factor can be independently associated with increased risk of cancer. So when we're thinking about added sugars, there's a variety of limits that we can try and stick to minimize our risk. The American Cancer Society has a recommended intake of less than 10% of daily calories per day, which comes out to about 50 grams of added sugars. And some organizations have slightly lower or more restrictive recommendations. So the World Health Organization recommends 10% of daily calories or less, and emphasizing that there are additional benefits to getting down to 5% of calories. And the American Heart Association also recommends sticking to less than 6% of daily calorie intake from added sugars. And that's because of some of the effects on inflammation and cardiovascular disease. So if we're thinking about keeping it down to below 6%, that would come out for 25 to 36 grams of added sugars, which is the equivalent of 6 to 9 teaspoons. And if we're looking at what the current average intake is for Americans, it's actually higher than all of these recommended limits. The average intake right now is around 68 grams per day, which is the equivalent of 17 teaspoons, or about a third of a cup of just added sugars, not total sugars. So speaking about this, where does fruit come into play here? To reduce our risk of cancer, should we start to avoid fruits because they contain fructose, or are they actually beneficial for cancer? Comment in the chat box what you think. Should we eat or avoid fruit? Eat fruit? Eat the fruit? Yes, I like it. Eat the fruit, certain ones. Okay, so fruit intake in cancer. This is where there's a lot of conflicting information online, but I would love just to nip that in the bud and say that increased fruit intake is actually linked to lower risk of multiple cancers and multiple chronic diseases. We actually consider fruit an anti-cancer type of food because of all the beneficial compounds like fiber and phytonutrients, like flavonoids, minerals, and vitamins that are all very beneficial for reducing the risk of cancer. And there's multiple reviews that show that fruit intake is linked to lower risks of multiple cancers, particularly of the digestive tract and colorectal cancer. There was a large review of over 1.2 million women in 2021 that found that total fruit consumption was associated with a 7% lower overall breast cancer risk, whereas fruit juice was actually associated with a 4% increased risk of breast cancer. So this is where, when we're thinking about all the benefits of fiber and that slowed digestion of the sugars into glucose, it's really important to focus on the total fruit. And then when we're looking at glycemic load, which takes into consideration fiber and the amount of impact that the carbohydrates are going to have on the digestion and absorption, the high glycemic load diet is associated with higher risk of overall cancer and breast cancer, whereas low is associated with reduced risk. In contrast to dietary sugars, blood sugar actually is something that if we have prolonged high fasting blood sugar, it is an increased risk factor for cancer. And there's a very recent big systematic review that was in Nature, which is a very influential journal, that looked at the relationship between high fasting blood sugar and 7 different cancers and saw that the average risk increased up to 20%, with the strongest evidence for colorectal, pancreatic, and breast cancer. So the chart on the next slide shows the 7 different types of cancer that they looked at and the average risk increase. So it can be really beneficial to focus on what can impact blood sugar and different strategies of reducing the potential increases in blood sugar after meals. So the next slide just has an overview of some of the things that we can do to reduce our or improve our blood sugar. And this is what we like to work with patients on, actually implementing some of these strategies, like choosing high fiber carbohydrates, pairing them with protein and fat, minimizing sugar sweetened beverages, prioritizing whole fruit instead of fruit juice, moving after meals, doing some resistance training, and then also sleep and stress can impact blood sugar. So all of these different lifestyle strategies can be more impactful for reducing our risk of cancer than just focusing on avoiding all sources of sugar. And on the next slide, we just have a little summary of what we talked about. So yes, just making sure that we're aware of the source and quantity of sugar that we're eating, incorporating lifestyle strategies to manage blood sugar. And then this was just an overview, a very quick overview of sugar, but we do have 2 larger webinars that are just on sugar on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to learn more, you can check that out on YouTube. And now I'll pass it over to Frida, who's going to talk about dairy and cancer.
All right, great. Thank you, Lotta. So much great information. So when it comes to dairy, this is also one of the most debated foods when it comes to cancer risk. And in this section, we're going to explore what the research says about the potential benefits, the risks, and also how to make more informed choices based on our individual needs and health goals. Does dairy intake increase or decrease cancer risk? Yes, it can increase, yes, a lot of yes, neither. All right, a lot of good answers. So let's dive in and see what the science says. But first of all, what is dairy? Dairy products are foods made from milk or milk-derived components from mammals. This could be from cows, from goats, or sheep. Milk, or we have 3 main categories. So when we think of milk, we have whole milk, we have low-fat milk, we have skim milk, lactose-free milk. It's often consumed as a beverage or used in cooking and baking. We have fermented products. So we think of yogurt, kefir, and cheese. The fermentation process adds a lot of beneficial probiotics and can also improve our digestibility. Then finally, we have processed dairy. So think of butter, cream, whey, casein, and milk powder. These are often used in cooking, baking, and food manufacturing. Something important to notice is that plant-based alternatives such as almonds, soy, and oat milk are not considered dairy, and the reason is because it's not coming from a mammalian milk. Also, eggs are not dairy, and this is because eggs are laid by birds which don't have mammary glands. Dairy is definitely a nutrient-dense food group. It provides high-quality protein, mainly from casein and whey. It's easily digested and support muscle health as well. Dairy provides a lot of minerals. It contains calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. These all support our cellular health. It reduces inflammation. It could also help reduce the risk of certain cancers, particularly colorectal cancer, which we will see in a moment, when consumed in balanced amounts. It also contains a lot of key vitamins. We have A, D, the fat-soluble ones, and then the water-soluble ones, B2 and B12. These vitamins support our normal cell growth, DNA integrity, also our immune defense, which are all critical in reducing cancer risk and progression as well. In the research context, so usually when studies are studying dairy, it's their intake, they usually consider the total milk and milk-based foods rather than individual products. Analysis often analyze the studies by the fat content. So they look at, is it whole milk? Do the consumer drink more low-fat milk? Do they consume fermented dairy, or is it non-fermented? So these are different distinctions that may influence the health outcomes. So why is there a link, or why do people often talk about the dairy intake and potential cancer risk? Well, the perceived link comes from the hormones in the milk, the fat content, calcium effects, and also population level observations. The evidence is definitely very inconsistent, with the strongest support for a protective effect on dairy on colorectal cancer and a possible modest risk for prostate cancer. The findings for breast cancer are pretty mixed. But overall, which was mentioned earlier in the webinar, is dairy is just one piece of a much larger diet. There's never one food group that could blame cancer or be the reason for a cancer diagnosis, for example. It's overall the lifestyle. The latest research shows that higher dairy consumption is associated with an increased risk of prostate cancer, while the relationship between dairy and breast cancer is more complex and may depend more on the type of dairy product and also individual factors. For prostate cancer, multiple large cohort studies and meta-analysis consistently report that men with higher intakes of dairy, especially milk, have a higher risk of developing prostate cancer. The risk appears to increase with each additional 400 grams of dairy per day. That looks like a couple of cups of milk. And this association is thought to be related by the effects of dairy on something called insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which potentially could promote cancer cell growth. For breast cancer, the evidence is more mixed. Most recent meta-analysis and pooled cohort studies suggest that an overall dairy intake is not associated with higher risk of breast cancer, but may even be protective, especially for ER-positive, estrogen receptor positive, and progesterone receptor positive subtypes. Low-fat and fermented dairy products, such as yogurt, are associated with a lower risk, particularly in postmenopausal women. However, there's also studies that report that a higher milk intake may increase the risk of estrogen receptor negative breast cancer, and higher dairy milk intake may be associated with an increased risk overall, especially when it is compared to plant-based alternatives. Recent research consistently shows that a higher dairy consumption is linked to a lower risk of colorectal cancer. Large cohort studies and meta-analysis report that a greater intake of total dairy, especially milk and dairy-derived calcium, reduces colorectal cancer incidence by about 10 to 20% compared with a low intake. The benefits appears to be dose-dependent, and it's largely attributed to the calcium. So both low-fat and whole milk, as well as cheese and other fermented dairy products, are associated with reduced risk, though the strongest evidence is for total dairy and milk. I want to emphasize that sugary dairy desserts do not show these benefits, so your favorite ice cream and cheesecake are not accounted for in this analysis. So as we can see, there's both benefits sometimes with dairy and certain cancers. There could also be risk with certain cancers. So this makes me curious.
I could watch last season,
What
but
is
I
the
haven't seen.
biological mechanisms explaining why dairy consumption is considered a risk factor for certain cancer and then not for others? So this really center around the interplay of the growth factors, hormones, and also calcium, which we see is beneficial in colorectal cancer. So specifically for prostate and breast cancer, especially cow's milk contains a lot of these bioactive compounds such as IGF-1, also estrogens. IGF-1 is known to promote cell proliferation and inhibit apoptosis, and a higher IGF-1 circulation also are associated with increased risk of both prostate and breast cancer. But then on the other hand, colorectal cancer, the protective effect of dairy is primarily attributed to the calcium content. So research shows that calcium binds to potentially carcinogenic bile acids and fatty acids in the gut, and therefore reducing the ability to damage these colonic epithelial cells and decrease the proliferation in the colorectal mucosa. Calcium also promotes differentiation and apoptosis of abnormal cells in the colon and therefore lower the cancer risk. So the context definitely matters. So who dairy may be beneficial for, somebody with extra nutrient needs. As we see, dairy could be a very nutrient-dense food. So people who need additional calcium, vitamin D, high-quality protein to support the bone health, muscle maintenance, or overall nutrition, they may benefit. Somebody needs extra calories. Somebody who don't have any dairy sensitivities can enjoy it as a part of a balanced diet. But then we have some people who may be more cautious. So definitely somebody with lactose intolerance who cannot break down lactose. They definitely want to stay away or choose lactose-free options. There could be personal or ethical preferences. And we also have specific health conditions as well. And then, of course, in the end of the day, the amount matters. Eating one little yogurt a day versus having a couple of glasses of milk with every meal is going to make a difference. The type of dairy, the nutrient profile, as we have seen, can vary. And then also individual tolerance as well. So now I will pass it over to Katie, who will discuss soy and cancer.
Thank you so much, Frida, Lotta, Shayna. Whew, everybody take a deep breath. I really appreciate what you shared at the end there, Frida. It's the dose makes the medicine or the poison. It's not about this one food is going to immediately cause cancer. We want to see the whole context, the portions, everything to do with this. And I think it's absolutely fascinating, these fears that we can have around specific foods, thinking about the hormones in soy versus the hormones in dairy. So dairy truly is designed, especially these milk products, milk is designed to help with growth. And as grown adults, we're not trying to exacerbate growth, right? Maybe if you're a bodybuilder, or of course, if you need those extra nutrients, like sometimes it is helpful to include more dairy in your lifestyle. However, in general for cancer, I think choosing a soy option is actually going to be more beneficial, and we're going to get into that. But as you can see this image, what is soy? As you can see here, we have simple soybeans, some edamame, different types of firmness with tofu or tempeh. We have soy milk and soy sauce. Yeah, soy can be present in a lot of different foods these days. So let's definitely dive into this and see what the research says. Opening up the chat box, is soy safe or harmful for breast cancer prevention? Let's see. Safe, yes. My gyno said to give up soy so doesn't increase ovarian cysts because it's like estrogen. That is very interesting. I've not seen the research on that. Safe, safe. All right. So as far as the ovarian cysts, please send us an email. I'm gonna dive into that research. But as far as I know, with the best evidence that I could find, let's go over this. Let's see. Let's come to a conclusion together. So soy consumption, it may actually help prevent cancer. So there is a difference though between whole soy that's been fermented, that's organic, like edamame, tofu, tempeh, unsweetened soy milk, especially for cultures who traditionally eat these foods, compared to processed soy, soy supplements, powders, faux meats, processed soybean oils. These are two very different things, and we don't have enough evidence to show the conclusion of the contrast between the two at this time. However, for these wholesome soy products, research does show that these isoflavones can bind to estrogen receptors and modulate their activity, exerting anti-estrogenic effects in tissues like breast and prostate, which may actually suppress hormone-dependent cancer development. So these isoflavones are not only present in soy foods. We're actually also going to see these in a lot of different plant foods and ground flax and broccoli. We see these antioxidants in a lot of fantastic cancer-preventing foods. Isoflavones, research shows getting more of them in can actually help with prevention of cancer growth, okay? Not exacerbation of it, which a lot of people think, yeah, they think the opposite, which is interesting. And I'm excited to go over more research in the next slide. A 2024 meta-analysis of 52 observational studies. So this was a huge meta-analysis, concluded high consumption of total soy products and soy milk was associated with reduced total cancer risk. So you can see on the right, these graphs. On the y-axis, we see the relative risk of cancer, and on the x-axis on the bottom, the total soy intake. So total soy, as that increased, the relative risk of cancer significantly decreased. And there was a dose response analysis indicated that for each 61 grams per day increment of tofu consumed, that reduced cancer by 12%, and each 23 gram per day increment of soy milk reduced cancer risk by 28%. This is quite significant, and it's interesting that people have it backwards, that soy can actually exacerbate cancer growth, when really the vast evidence is showing us that it helps to suppress cancer growth, actually. So does soy intake increase cancer risk? From what I just showed you, and I do have some more research to share, phytoestrogens are not equivalent to estrogen. And this myth actually does stem from under a microscope. There was some research done and in mice models, but it turns out humans are very different than mice. And the research does not support that soy increases cancer risk. These phyto or plant estrogens, such as soy isoflavones, they are much, much, much weaker than our mammalian estrogens, and they're actually tissue selective estrogenic effect compared to endogenous estrogen. It's just much different. So these phytoestrogens, these isoflavones, they really do not exhibit the same biological potency. It's vastly different if you think about what Frida just shared about dairy. While yes, the dose makes the medicine or the poison, and it's different for everybody, there actually is mammalian hormones and estrogen in dairy. But in soy products, this is a very different, these plant estrogens act differently, okay? Large human studies and meta-analyses have shown that soy food consumption is not associated with increased breast cancer risk. In fact, moderate soy intake may be protective or neutral, especially when part of a traditional diet. As you can see here, there's some veggies, some in this miso soup, maybe some mushrooms, right? In a part of a balanced veggie forward, antioxidant forward diet, sure, a couple of servings of soy foods is going to probably be helpful. And there's always going to be nuances here, just like Frida and Lotta were mentioning. Where are your ancestors from? You know, some people may be able to process dairy a lot better than others. Some people may be able to process soy a lot better than others. And it's kind of impossible to really say for the population, everybody out there, that something is going to be beneficial or harmful. We need to look at each individual and we need to look at each individual. And that's why we really, at the Create Cures Foundation, make sure to see what's going to work for you and what's not going to work for you, instead of just saying one food is necessarily good or bad. But I digress. Let's go over some more research here. So I did my darndest to see, okay, what about other types of cancer besides breast cancer and prostate cancer? There's a lot of research on soy specifically. So there were these two studies, one of them over 74 meta-analyses and umbrella review, another one looking at 52 studies from 2024 and 2025. The first one showing a 31% decreased relative risk of all cancers related to soy intake and overall plant-based diet and overall plant food intake, including soy for this next one, a 7% decreased relative risk of cancer for those eating more plant foods, including soy. Same thing with colon and colorectal cancer, 22% decreased risk, 21% decreased risk, 9% decreased risk. These are really large studies, these meta-analyses. It's pretty consistent over a bunch of different types of cancers, including lung cancer. Lung cancer was actually mentioned a lot in these studies. A 23% decreased risk from lung cancer for those who ate more, of course, plant foods in general, but also including soy products. 37% decreased risk. This is one cohort study and 7 meta-analyses. So take a deep breath, as Shayna mentioned. And hey, yeah, let's not be afraid of the tofu, the soy. And hey, of course, if tofu gives you a stomach ache or if you notice it's affecting you negatively, just because this research is saying that for the vast majority of people, this is generally going to be something positive to include, to optimize. Hey, maybe you have an individual allergy or intolerance, and that's totally okay, right? So in general, going to the next slide, what's the consensus? Major guidelines like the American Cancer Society and National Comprehensive Cancer Network, the NCCN, they do recommend moderate soy intake up to 3 servings per day for individuals with active cancer, including those with hormone-sensitive cancers. They'd cite no evidence of harm and possible benefits for overall health and cancer outcomes. Moderate soy food intake for cancer survivors as well is what they recommend, noting no adverse effects and possible benefits. So whether you have active hormone sensitive cancer or are a cancer survivor, it is recommended to include soy products up to 3 servings a day, including unsweetened soy milk, tofu, etc. And of course, we advise, and these organizations advise against high dose supplements and excessive intake. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines specifically state most studies show moderate soy consumption is associated with reduced recurrence and improved survival of cancer, particularly in breast and lung cancer. Absolutely incredible. Let's include, I love this image here. One of my favorite things is a tofu scramble. So instead of scrambling up some eggs that have, of course, in that egg yolk, we've got that cholesterol and things. It's nice to just try to incorporate some more tofu in our lives. We can have some nutritional yeast, some turmeric and spices with all of your favorite vegetables for a really balanced, yummy, savory breakfast option, this tofu scramble. So I hope that this helps, and I'm looking forward to answering. If you have questions at the end, please ask those in the chat box.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. It's so great to hear about all the benefits of soy and some benefits of dairy and how to navigate sugar too. I hope everybody is a little bit clear now, but let's go over some of the takeaways that we learned today. So with sugar, we talked about some myths. Sugar causes cancer, sugar feeds cancer, and what does the truth say? So sugar is not the only factor that can influence tumor growth. There's so many other things, like Frida mentioned, a specific IGF-1 pathway growth factor, which also influences tumor growth. So there's so many things there. The source of your sugar matters, right? So whether you're having sugar sweetened beverages or a blueberry, it's very different. High fasting blood sugar is a risk factor that can be managed through diet and lifestyle. And this is one of the biggest risks in terms of cancer and sugar. So managing that through your diet and lifestyle is super important. And what do we do here? So we can choose low glycemic carbohydrates. So think the things with more fiber, like our whole grains and even high fiber fruits and vegetables. So you can also consume a whole fruit rather than a fruit juice, which takes out that fiber component. You can consume carbs as part of a balanced plate to reduce your blood sugar spikes. So incorporating other things like fats and fiber to help balance it. And then incorporate lifestyle strategies like Lotta mentioned about walking and weightlifting because muscle really loves glucose. So incorporating that can really support your blood sugar. With dairy, we talked about the myth, all dairy increases cancer risk, but actually it's not so clear. And like Frida mentioned, such interesting research around dairy and different types of cancers, like in estrogen and prostate cancer versus colorectal, where it seemed a little bit more beneficial. And we found that fermented dairy might be the best in terms of lowering risk. And what can we do here? So that fermented dairy, think like your yogurt and some cheeses, and you can choose those, but even sheep and goat dairy rather than cow dairy can actually have less of an impact on your IGF-1 level. So try to choose your best quality, minimally processed dairy with that's low in sugar. But dairy, again, is this not so clear one. So talk to a dietitian or a health professional that is well aware of the research to see how often you should consume dairy. And then finally, soy. I love debunking this one because people heard that soy feeds cancer, it increases your estrogen, but actually it is a phytoestrogen, meaning it can attach to excess estrogen in the body and even in the breast and help buffer out that excess estrogen. So there's so many large studies that show that it's not associated with an increased risk of breast cancer or most cancers, and it's actually pretty protective. We talked about the actions, right? So choosing organic forms, minimally processed forms like soy milk, tempeh, tofu, edamame. You can consume it a few times a week. So depending on where your family's originated, you might want to consume it more or a little bit less if your ancestors were not consuming so much soy. So we usually recommend about a couple times a week. And you can also have flax seeds, which are a really great source of phytoestrogens too. So we tell all our patients this. If you are a patient of Create Cures, you've probably heard this formula. This is how to build the most anti-cancer plate. And the formula is half of your plate should be non-starchy vegetables. A quarter of it should be a high fiber carbohydrate, like your whole grain, or your starchy vegetable, like sweet potatoes. And then that last quarter should be your healthy protein. And then top it all off with some healthy fats, some olive oil, nuts and seeds, and then choose a low calorie, 0 calorie water or drink. And this just simplifies meal planning, eating out, and it's just a really foolproof way to also support your blood sugar regulation as well. And at Create Cures too, we emphasize the longevity diet, and let's go in a little bit of detail about it. So the longevity diet is a plant-centric diet. It can be adapted for anybody. So at Create Cures, we don't just hand out this diet. It's really supposed to be individualized. So like we've said today, it depends, the type of protein, dairy, non-dairy, all of these things should be individualized. But what the longevity diet includes is complex carbs. It includes low mercury fish, a lot of plant proteins like soy and phytoestrogens, healthy fats, and then lots of colors. Really, all the vegetables as possible. It's gonna protect your healthy cells. What does it not include so much is a lot of high protein foods, like Frida mentioned, that IGF-1 pathway is somewhat associated with protein. So not so high in that. We definitely don't want a lot of sugars or ultra processed foods. And for more information about meal timing, generally we recommend a 12 to 14-hour fast overnight. But like I said, it should be really individualized, and we can definitely help individualize the longevity diet to everybody. Okay, so it's finally quiz time. I hope everybody's ready and is aware of all the information here. So first question is, what is one food that you will reach for when you have a sweet tooth to stay in alignment with a healthy diet? So comment in the chat box. I want to see all your answers. Okay, someone said blueberry. Apple, fruit, nice. Whole fruit, hopefully. Great. Perfect. Next question. What populations should minimize dairy? It's a tough one. Anybody confident in the chat box? Maybe breast cancer? Yeah. Interesting. Maybe not colon cancer. Maybe that one was more so protective, but interesting thought. And then lastly, should soy foods like soy, tofu, and soy milk be avoided to help prevent prevent cancer in general? Hope everybody knows this. No, exactly. We should not avoid these. We should include them and include them in a great way. So again, we are the Create Cures Clinic. We are a nonprofit, so we work to aim to reach and provide services to as many people as possible. So we definitely provide programs for people who might not feel like they can afford normal nutrition counseling. There's something for you, I promise. We offer these programs that are on a yearly basis, so we really want to support and monitor our patients. It's all integrative, personalized strategies for your individual treatment plan. Like we are the dietitians here, so we collaborate with us, Dr. Longo, and our molecular biologist. And you could even work with Dr. Longo specifically on your case. So we'll put in our email too. I'll show you at the end, and feel free to reach out to us too. We have other webinars upcoming on Create Cures website. So once you reach out to us, you'll definitely get an email from us and with links to the webinar. So I hope you'll join the next one. It's alcohol, longevity, and cancer, another really hot topic. And it's Wednesday, November 12th at 5 p.m. We have a lot of other exciting ones too, but I really want to get to your questions. And yeah, this is our information, our email, clinic@createcures.org. You can find our website too and our YouTube. And really, we'd love to work with all of you and support anybody in whatever journey they're on. So now it's time for the Q&A. We're all gonna answer some questions, and I'm gonna see if there's one right now.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been really in the chat box. Thank you everybody so much for participating and for all of your questions. I just quickly answered this question about, are eggs bad? I thought the egg cholesterol link was debunked. And just like, as we mentioned throughout this webinar, we are not able to say one specific food is bad or good. It's really, what is your whole lifestyle? What does your whole diet look like? And I highly recommend reaching out to us, clinic@createcures.org, because if you like eggs and you're consistently consuming eggs, maybe you're not eating enough of other foods and you're overdoing it with protein or overdoing it with certain things. So we can really help to balance things out. And I'm not necessarily saying that we've got to throw all of the eggs out the window and only eat tofu scramble, but hey, the research shows that incorporating more tofu can really drive down cancer risk. So if you like scrambled eggs, maybe switch it up sometimes and try a tofu scramble, or even put a little bit of tofu in your scrambled eggs, something like that. But this is something, looking over your blood lipid profile, we can go over your unique needs and your unique health situation and further help craft a balanced diet that includes the food you love without overdoing it or underdoing it on any nutrients. So yeah, reach out to us for sure.
I would like to target one of the questions regarding the benefits of calcium. I mentioned one study that the benefits of dairy and colorectal cancer is the calcium from dairy. And you can definitely get calcium from a lot of other sources. However, the calcium from dairy and soy has a very high bioavailability. It has a less bioavailability from plant sources. However, that's why we want you to eat a lot of plants to get a lot of calcium. But mainly the strong benefit from dairy is because of the very high bioavailability, and also other plant-based milks are fortified with calcium, which again doesn't have as high bioavailability. But based on my research, soy milk and dairy has a pretty similar bioavailability. So those are some good news. And then while I'm at it, I just want to answer another question regarding the different types of plant-based milk. So I would say, based on your individual goals, maybe you want unsweetened almond milk over oat milk if you're trying to cut calories. If you want to try to get more protein from your plant-based milk, now maybe you should choose soy milk over almond milk, which is basically water. So again, always go back to what are your individual needs. That's why it's always great to see a dietitian so we could really guide you through your personal journey.
Awesome. So I saw a question about plant-based protein powders, an article recently saying they contained lead due to heavy metal in the soil. And so someone asked, are plant-based milk alternatives also risky? So yeah, like Katie said, they just did a webinar on this and environmental toxins. So please reach out to our Create Cures YouTube and have a look on that. But and Katie, you can bounce off too, but plant-based milk is a lot different than plant-based protein powders in terms of the high concentration in there in the source. So usually plant-based milk are pretty good. And like Frida was just saying, variety is really what we want to strive for. So getting a good variety of different plant-based proteins, whether it's nuts and seeds and soy and beans and legumes, is really going to be great. You don't want to just focus on one thing. And even protein powders, if you're having it every single day, all the time, maybe you switch it out for different types of the plant-based protein. So whether it's different nuts or seeds too.
I also just wanted to answer two questions in the chat about sweeteners. So there's a question, is honey a simple sugar? And yes, honey would be considered an added sugar. It's mostly glucose and fructose, which are two simple sugars. So it is something to kind of be mindful of. But one thing that we have seen is sweeteners, the unrefined sweeteners like honey or coconut sugar or maple syrup. Sometimes it's easier to use a smaller amount of them because they have more flavor. So if we're adding like honey to peanut butter, it can be easier to add a little bit less than adding like plain sugar or having a yogurt that already has a lot of sugar in it. So yes, it is a simple sugar or an added sugar, but for some people it can be an easier way to reduce their added sugar intake. And then there was a question about monk fruit. And monk fruit does not increase blood sugar, and it's also not been shown to have a lot of detrimental effects on like gut health or anything like that. So if you're looking to reduce your added sugar intake, monk fruit can be a good alternative.
Thank you. I love everybody's questions. This is awesome. Okay, so did the studies on soy and cancer distinguish between GMO and non-GMO? Not to my knowledge. I don't know the answer to this. I really want to go back and see, but as far as I know, it was not distinguished. But in general, I recommend if it's possible to purchase a certified organic soy. It's interesting where soy exists in these different processed foods, because usually if you're buying soy milk, tofu, it will say non-GMO or organic because of this. A lot of it is genetically modified. However, things like faux meats and cheeses and different types of supplements, these may not necessarily be non-GMO. But I don't know. I think it is better in general to eat something that's a soy food that's not necessarily organic than to not eat it at all, based on how significant the research was. And a couple more questions. I wanted to just piggyback on what Shayna answered about the protein powders. That's a fantastic question. And really, I've been going crazy looking at all of my patient supplements and seeing if they have purity certifications behind them. Do they have lead contamination? So if you are going to be purchasing a protein powder, I highly recommend looking for the NSF circle to make sure it is third-party purity certified, or just reaching out to us to see, because we do have a subscription to a third-party testing site where we can recommend approved products that are actually what they say they are, because unfortunately a lot of supplements, they're not approved, and they do have a lot of lead, especially for little ones or breastfeeding women, pregnant women. These heavy metals can really cause some harm if you're overdoing it with these specific supplements. And that brings me to the calcium supplementation. We really would love to see how much calcium are you taking in, and do you really need a calcium supplement in order to protect your bones? That's so important. Anybody on any estrogen suppressing treatments, it's gonna put us at risk of bone loss, right? But instead of just popping more calcium, making sure we're getting in plenty of calcium, let's really utilize our muscles, utilize our bones, get in enough vitamin D, and take in as much calcium from whole food sources like collard greens. Cooked collard greens are fantastic, kale, broccoli, tahini. And then sure, if a little bit of calcium supplementation is necessary, we will recommend it, but calcium in supplement form can be a little harmful. It can actually cause calcium oxalate kidney stones and calcification in other areas of the body. So we don't necessarily want to just throw it out there that people should be supplementing with calcium. It's very individualized. Yeah, these are amazing questions.
I have one more, super quick. So there was a question about the heavy metals in plant-based milk, because there's a lot of conversation about the heavy metals in plant-based protein powders. So if you think of a protein powder, it's really, really processed. And with any food that has been highly processed, there's going to be more stabilizers, different ingredients that have higher concentrations of the heavy metals. So that's why when it comes to plant-based milk, although yes, it is somewhat processed, anything is processed unless you just picked it really from the tree. It has definitely lower concentration. So that's why the heavy metals haven't been that big concern in plant-based milk.
Great point. And we probably have time for one more question, but I do also want to add in terms of bone health that, like Katie mentioned, and I think someone asked before about other ways to get your calcium in besides dairy. And like she said, tahini, collard greens, these are all really great forms. But also your lifestyle does have a big impact on your bone health too. So resistance training is really, really important for bone health. And also impact. So whether it's running or doing some sort of impact, that stimulates bone production. So super important. Does anybody want to take the last question? Maybe Lotta?
Sure. I saw that there was a question about stevia and blood sugar. So stevia on its own is not shown to raise blood sugar, but often stevia can be combined with other things in the powder. So it might have some dextrose or some maltodextrin or some other additives that can increase blood sugar. So stevia is another option when we're looking at pure stevia extract.
Yeah, I thought that would probably be the easiest.
Pure stevia leaf, that and monk fruit are two things that we do recommend as sweet sugar alternatives if somebody's looking to reduce their sugar intake.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for such an informative presentation, and everyone for all your great questions. We appreciate your time and effort and all the research that was really put into putting together this presentation. So thank you so much again.